thank you to Tom, and I'm also very grateful to have the chance to share the panel with Catherine, from whose work I've learned a lot and I'm still learning. So hope they'll be generative. I'll just, in many ways, what I'll speak about will begin quite sort of physically or literally on the outskirts of a school, of a university, pass into them, and in some sense head back out from them. So in many ways, this is perhaps less just on literal educational architectures, but the sort of tensions and frictions that perhaps exceed them in some way. Okay. This is an epigraph that felt fitting for this, from Birch and reads, "So you want to build a school," 1947. "The walls are built to be surreptitiously kicked." The barricade, according to some significant historians of the topic, is a form of antagonistic architecture that's been largely outmoded, or at least so transformed in their role as to constitute something other. Ari Kazan, for instance, notes that, quote, though the 20th century had no shortage of riots, insurrections, and revolutions, the barricade remained a marginal element. The reasons for this are material rather than psychological or political. The physiognomy of cities has changed. Under the axe of the demolishers, the old, narrow, winding streets inherited from the Middle Ages made way for boulevards and avenues whose width and straight lines are unpropitious for barricades. And to a degree, this is surely right. Against the prospect of fully militarized and technicized security forces, the ad hoc construction of blockages of the city with the city itself, with provisional materials that are suddenly made modular or torn up, stands little chance. If anything, what stops that full advance of aggression is not a built structure, but the mutable contract of bracketed or limited aggression, the relative degree, in most situations of unrest, in which neither cops nor demonstrators bring their full firepower, literally or figuratively. And it remains a tipping point when live rounds are used, one that is profoundly racialized in terms of when that point is crossed. Towards that end, I'd note in the history of also university occupations, this kind of compelling moment from Eleanor Raskin's recitation of the Columbia occupations of '68, in which you get a doubling of the figure of the barricade. On the one hand, a physical construction inside, and on the other hand, the presence of white students outside facing lines of police. It's a complicated history, but this is a sort of striking moment within it. Of course, as Hazan also notes, and people like Mark Traugott suggest as well, barricades were never purely material. Already in the 19th century, they were also symbolic, as, quote, to unpave a street, overturn a cart, pile up furniture, is to give a signal. It's to show one's determination to fight and to fight together, end quote. And to focus on a purely physical or tactical role would miss out on a different conception advanced by revolutionary theorists themselves, namely the degree to which barricades matter because they produce a halt and a split in time, an interval in which one comes face to face with the enemy and potentially in which defection can occur as stabilized roles become liquid. And there's a long history of this. I'd just note some rather infamous ones. Trotsky in 1907, to some degree kind of citing Engels, in which for him the barricade matters not as a physical obstacle, but, quote, by creating a temporary barrier to the movement of troops, it brings them into close contact with the people. In some sense, it allows for sort of speech to occur face to face. In another moment, shown to me by Dubravka Sekulic, who was involved with the project but couldn't be here, I thought I'd share also this moment in her absence. Quote, there was a folk saying in Yugoslavia, the snow falls on the hills not just to cover them, but to show the tracks of the animals. The June version of the saying was, the barricade is not to block the street, but to show who is on the other side, which I think is a remarkable moment. So in practical terms, of course, also barricades continue to be built, and with particularly visible results or use around struggles that issue from students, take place in your education. In Hong Kong this year, for instance, there were not only these sort of classically standard barricades built at the entrances of the Polytechnic University, itself formally established in '72. There's also these remarkable constructions referred to by protesters as, quote, brick battlegrounds or mini Stonehenges, which what's great about them, they're not purely decorative, actually. They block the advance of police vehicles, and they are necessarily self-reinforcing defensive architectures, because if the brick on top is knocked off, it falls and buttresses the other two standing upright. So each one of these is a tiny machine to kind of self-support. However, the technical conditions of coming face to face, as we know, against heavily militarized police has radically changed, and it's been made kind of deeply one-sided, not just because of the degree of armed force, but above all through machine vision and facial recognition. And much as Manuel de Landa suggests that we might understand the effects of long-range bombing as causing, quote, the fortress to dematerialize into the electronic radar curtain, so too I'd say the space of the barricade has become variable and constantly located, not between two opposing sets of bodies, but between counter technics seeking to capture and evade. On the one hand, cameras and software, and on the other, not just the kind of famed umbrellas of the protests in Hong Kong, but now laser pointers, which, as you might know, not only distract police and point out security forces to other protesters, but also aim to essentially blind the cameras used for facial recognition and to produce an opacity. And like the materials that become barricades, the laser is misused in a particularly striking way, right? Inverting a device most formally associated with education and business, and as I was happy to learn yesterday, also Hakave, apparently. There's one in use all day. I stress this, though, because I think it's a crucial instance of a form of education beyond education, a sort of profound learning and experimentation that weaponizes quite literally a tool for professionalization, training, and subject formation against forces that might seek to dictate the terms of that process. And crucially, these are radical innovations that drift, that don't need the channels of formal education to be taught. And so I would note in that regard the way in Chile, for instance, it's also become a crucial part of demonstrations there, forming not only then a tactic, but a crucial kind of image that reverberates across media networks. A sort of education by transmission in that way becomes kind of part of a radical imaginary, a sort of barricade for this century, including the more visible, potentially not known to verify that this really happened or not, but this footage of people bringing down a police drone by kind of hundreds of laser pointers pointing at it. Whether or not that's true, it sort of entered the process of possibility. So I'm starting with this because I'm going to drink some water before my throat closes on me. My apologies for the harsh voice. So I'm starting with all this because I think it's emblematic of the question of the channels and pathways that lead out of and against certain kinds of education, and also of the shifting backdrop of securitization that runs through the design of educational architecture and its inseparability from other infrastructural and architectural shifts and the challenges posed to it. And in this regard, considering other trend lines, particularly in the US, where I'm going to kind of speak about a little more concretely, the other side of securitization, the present, would surely take shape quite bleakly between, on the one hand, mass shooting, in which training against possible mass shooters involves learning to barricade one's own classroom for very different reasons than a sort of 68 in there, including also moments in which one can be arrested for building navigable maps for first-person shooters of your own high school, in some regard there. This speculative blueprint became reasons to be expelled. On the other hand, of course, crucially for telling this story is the massive proliferation of debt in terms of the transformation of the precarity and doubt involved in this, in which drastic increase in the cost of higher education, as we know, leads to untenable levels of borrowing and the thorough evacuation of future possibility, but itself becomes the opportunity for increased profits, not just for universities who preserve their credit rating, but also by people who kind of profit off trading, literally securitized sort of student loan asset-backed securities, they're called. And lastly, and maybe most crucially for what I'm talking about sort of proleptically, is the radical extension of security discourse more generally over the past 2 decades, which involved the reorganization of security agencies under the umbrella of Homeland Security, as I'm sure everyone knows. I think that's an operation whose import can't be missed. By grouping together natural disaster response, bioterrorism, and immigration control, amongst others, it performs this sort of crucial ideological labor of kind of ontologically flattening the radically disparate into this unified landscape of danger. Right? It turns sort of necessary human mobility, neurotoxins, hackers, and floods as sort of multiple elements of the same kind of common enemy. In this regard, it sort of echoes what some military theorists, I think, have aptly termed a threatscape, the radical expansion of possible hostility into a consistently networked space, one in which security remains a consistent and pressing need, and only must be decided how covertly or not to disguise it. This is from a rather fascinating although deeply non-critical article about how to sort of landscape and beautify literally fortressed military installations in some regard there. That's you could say, a question that has extended more widely than just actual bases. How do we do it without making everything into a bunker? So from the perspective of the education shock decades, this is of course a situation to come, but I'm stressing this more kind of present moment because I think we can see in it a mutation and extension of a particular logic that in many ways sort of took special shape in the decades around the project more particularly. This is one of the spatial and infrastructural stabilization of particular limits, systems, and demands that manage to conceal their force and kind of flexibility under the sign of kind of user-generated or user-demanded flexibility, autonomy, and risk. And perhaps instructive in this, the passage my title comes from, in this perhaps emblematic of the whole question, comes from the militant sociologist and theorist of co-research of Con Ricerca, Romano Alquati, writing in the early 60s in these incredible studies of Olivetti and transforming management structures there. So in the studies of this, he writes, the plan isn't given objectively, just as the structure of productive organization or the technical level of capital isn't either. It structures itself as a flexible and articulated cage that, under the sign of an objective rationality, tends to bind together the working class with the anarchy of the productive moment. But above the cage, the boss holds on to and carefully increases his freedom of action, certainly not as a free individual entrepreneur, but as a member and functionary of social capital that exploits the labor of the working class and translates even the local antagonistic surges of workers in revolt into a mechanism for the modernization and realization of their own cage. So this detour of sort of potential resistance back into a further refinement of variable control, and especially this dislocation from visible hierarchies into lived space, is very central to my work and thinking more generally. It's something I've been kind of putting under the sign more broadly, this category of kind of interchange. And for me, this marks that particular fusion of naturalization and emergency that we know all too well, but I think crucially in terms of thinking also of histories of revolt and resistance, will require an almost paranoid, obstinate refusal to allow new capital projects and the kind of landscapes they build to not be natural, necessary, objective, and responsive. So this is what marks the forms of community organization, and indeed in a different context, as was raised yesterday, kind of militant education that I'll return to at the end, unfolding particularly in the examples I'll give against the spatial logics of racial policing, of destruction of neighborhoods by means of highway construction, and of attempted construction of airports on peasant land. But to reach there and to eventually kind of rejoin the barricade, I want to consider the role and function of these landscapes of interchange, of kind of adaptive control, we could say, or at least the fantasy of that, both as themselves kind of covertly and almost ergonomically pedagogical, and I mean that in the sense of training certain forms of repeated activity in the world, and as a kind of specific element of literal educational architectures. Okay, so I will take an example from where I teach, because it's way too emblematic of this. To a large degree, American educational architectures and campus design have long, this is an absurd photo, by the way. This is their promotional page. I'm sorry, Bard, but Jesus. In any case, they've long turned in kind of variable ways on a kind of particular negotiation and management, you could say, of the open in some sense. So that's especially apparent in the kind of long-standing, not just pastoral, but kind of Arcadian ideologies at work in the imaginaries of semi-rural campuses like this, or kind of gated pseudo-nature of places like Yale, kind of carefully gated, kind of securitized spaces. I think this kind of managed Arcadian or kind of pastoral remove could also be seen in perhaps kind of later historical development, the search for primary and secondary school classroom designs centered on kind of openness towards the exterior that I think are especially common and influential in some of, I picked here intentionally, one of the most celebrated designs in this history, like Crow Island in Illinois. So especially with the profound expansion of air conditioning across mid-century America and the architectural shifts that brings in schools and offices alike, This can result in a particular vision, this one nicely kind of technicolor here, of kind of access to green space that's nevertheless held at a distance, preserved behind glass, which often does not open. Literally, my elementary school had kind of floor-to-ceiling windows that you could not open no matter the heat. And in this way reinforces a particular form of vision as kind of landscape contemplation. It's a form of, you could say, like a bracketed interaction, a partitioned and literally framed site of restoration or a kind of visual reserve, to invoke a term key, it seems like, to this wider project here. You sort of recharge your batteries with a kind of moment of pseudo-nature. But there's a different conception of landscape that will come to play a major role within not just sort of expanded orbits of educational architecture, but also the design of lived and working space more generally. And this is the version of landscape at work in Bürolandschaft, in office landscape. I don't think, and I don't want to claim that we should see this as some unique cause or influence, but I think particularly the most canonical examples of this lets us see with a sort of particular clarity the strictures of enforced creativity, the sort of invisible edges where autonomy runs up against the insistence on a very certain kind of productivity and knowledge subject. So in a crucial sense, this shifts from a kind of staging of landscape, right, that partial, restricted, perhaps through a single atrium or window, to a landscaping of activity in some regard there, one in which kind of diagrams of flows and the physical forms that reinforce them sort of merge homologically. Within that, it articulates, you could say, a kind of delimited flexibility, a net of possible flows. That tension between free play and restriction is especially visible in the diagrams, right, where a more kind of classical grid is modified into a kind of mesh of possible movement. It's one which I was very glad that brought up previously, because I was already going to talk about this. I think it's a tension that's amply picked up or echoes maybe through Archizoom as well, and this sort of speculative and nihilistic extension of this logic, this sort of falsified landscape in No Stop City, where it exits the office to become a contagious operation to spread a kind of an urbanism without end. And again, as I think you rightly pointed out, in some sense, one in which sort of information, particularly information to be kind of analyzed, and the forms themselves become sort of inseparable in some regard here. The brilliant line they have in this, which is this kind of accelerative logic of the office landscape, the famous one here, it says, an architecture which took a fearless look at the logic of gray, atheistic, and de-dramatized industrialism, where mass production produced infinite urban decors, but one through which we get sort of a slight kind of squiggle or wobble. So these spaces are not just diagrammable, though. Indeed, we might, or I would want to argue, we should think of them as diagrams, in the sense that Deleuze raises, meaning a map of the relation of forces. Because the basic conceit of such a landscape is that very homology, a literalist correspondence between social relations and diagrams of how these might unfold in space. In other words, if a space looks adequately open, variable, modular, malleable, and unlikely to restrict innovative and spontaneous flows and points of contact, then so too will the general intellect and sociability that's supposed to unfold in them. You could say that's the basic premise of it here, fittingly in the discourse around it in ways that it'll unfold, allow the kind of external shape to be unaltered, simply rearranging elements within in a kind of theater of pseudo-flexibility. This is amplified by Duffy and Worthington's language, especially theatrical, of shell, scenery, and sets, which is sort of all too potent here. Of course, though, there were endlessly kind of thoroughly criticized spaces in many ways, linked all in some sense to a break between user knowledge and supposed function. One of these concerns obviously the enormous problem of sound and sort of sound bleed between, I guess, museum and office. I teach in a curatorial program, as you can tell, so I'm using sound bleed. But in some sense, anyone who's worked in these knows that feeling. The other thing that was often noted was this experience of being under permanent but casual or kind of informal surveillance. So Oldham and Brass, for instance, in a 1979 text titled Employee Reactions to an Open Plan Office, a naturally occurring quasi-experiment, they note that, quote, private space is often desirable if evaluative feedback is to be offered. Open plan offices, on the other hand, provide virtually no private space. In short, every evaluation is subject to the evaluation of others, which is likely to create discomfort among supervisors and peers and a net reduction in feedback. They also detail further that the language employees were using in their studies to describe it was a, quote, fishbowl, cage, or warehouse. So again, this sort of flexible cage. It's unsurprising, perhaps, that they'll drift into popular culture formations. For instance, as a consummately modern villain's lair comes to be a stand-in for a sort of hellish site of conspiracy. But in some sense, with a further little recalibration into contemporary ideologies of labor that have fully swallowed this logic of lifelong learning and kind of knowledge workers pioneered perhaps in the education shock years, but which have been marked by a sort of startling degree of, I guess you'd call it like a kindergartization or something like that. This sort of permanent neoteny of creative labor, recrossing the old line between open plan offices and schools. You want the extreme version here. And yet within these regimes of labor, quote unquote, and their fetishistic fixation of disruption, as if the kids can finally go wild and disrupt, there's never a substantive transformation of the base parameters and problems of the open plan model, leading us to things like this, right? The basic incompatibility of working with many humans in a wall-less space is answered in some sense by just further blocks to be bought, these airless modules, sort of incubators in the literal sense, or in the solo version, yuppie coffins, that in some sense, though, turn back the clock and just reinvent the phone booth. There's a remarkable retroactivity here in which, congratulations, you figured out a phone booth. Okay, turning more explicitly to how crises of what, riffing off Manfredo Tafuri, we might call the failed utopia of the open plan, towards American educational construction specifically, we might look both fore and aft to see various strategies of negotiation and management. On one side, we can see a similar kind of modularity in the massive increased use of portable classrooms, which spiked to as many as 75,000 in California alone, with the early 2000s, a true proliferation there. They're striking because they throw out the window any promise of environment shaping user experience and just give in to the logic of stark necessity and ad hoc solution. We could also speak, and I'm gonna sort of skip over this now, maybe we can return to questions, but about, for the sake of time, particular forms of campus design, including those that I've lived and worked and organized at, but I'm gonna come back to this perhaps in questions to save some time. Because I want to note around those same years as well, this sort of within criminology and educational sociology, far more direct reliances upon a design of space to defer or redirect kind of potential chaos or hostility. Crucially, again, in ways that avoid announcing their control protocols. So for instance, you have in '72 Oscar Newman's Defensible Space, which is still invoked in guides and workshops on campus security methods and its search for territoriality, surveillance, image, milieu. You also have in '69 Weinmeier's assertion that 90% of vandalism can be prevented via design. It's a problem not for policing, but just walls that you don't want to vandalize. Or Jackson and Schroeder introduced what they call kind of behavioral zoning that tries to basically ward off damage caused by stimulation seekers at colleges, in some sense. They have a kind of tea kettle metaphor of releasing it from there. But I think we can see this question of the landscaping of activity also in the study of and discourse around specifically kind of open plan schools and classrooms. One of the things that's really striking in this, just to speak about it briefly, at least is the kind of linguistic marking of the lexicon of kind of survival that runs through these, this sort of imposition in texts from the mid to late 70s, in some sense there, directly at odds with educators. So you have, for instance, in the former here, there's some sense that the educators will come to feel that their relationship with students, their instructional programs, their friendships with other teachers, and even their sanity are at stake. Even more dramatically, in the other we have here, it's a language of a kind of traumatic instance in some sense in which you cannot withdraw mentally or physically from the ongoing events in the school wing. This text also has one of the saddest and bleakest little questionnaires in there that just says, do you like a flexible environment? Are walls important to you? Like, oh God, it's sort of terrible. In some sense, of course, we also guess architectural history is deeply marked by often conservative attempts to bemoan alleged utopian schemes. But I think what's particular here is the way in which in studies we get, like Evans' work or Bennett and Hyland's stuff in the late 70s, the way in which they come to note that even in putatively kind of flexibly partitioned or sort of flexible spaces, there's in many ways a sort of active attempt to recreate barriers within them, used by them. So in Bennett Hyland's reading, Evans was also struck by the isolation of many teacher territories, where linking doors between contiguous classrooms were bolted or plastered over with display material so that opening them could have created a major disturbance. They note also the use of kind of low furniture and other elements to essentially repartition, or in some sense to kind of build barricades in the most sort of casual sense of that. So I want to end here, as I started, by stepping outside of the school once more, beyond the kind of provisional barriers, to gesture to two strategies and moments, perhaps of counter-education, both for and through processes of struggle. These are ones that occur precisely at that juncture of landscape I've already kind of identified, especially through a potent refusal to let the dynamics be treated as natural or necessary, and also to challenge what kind of knowledge was legitimated to contest that, in some sense. These are, you might say, forms of blockage, again, beyond barricades, that contest not just current forces, but specifically a kind of future shock of a different sort. And I'm only going to gesture to them each here for the sake of time. The first example I wanted to raise or mention is from Baltimore, crucially, which we might situate between, on the one hand, freeway revolt history, and on the other, of sort of counter-education processes like the Black Panthers, including not just kind of the work at Oakland Community School, but also things like SAFE, Seniors Against a Fearful Environment, which involved this sort of 6-week comparative crime study. It's remarkable sort of informal, extra-institutional work of gathering statistics by which one can say policing is explicitly racialized in some sense to avoid the claim paranoia. We might also think about it in terms of their claims, the centrality and 10-point plan of a sort of boycott against the lack of adequate teaching, or of other counter-cartographies, efforts like that of William Bunge in books like Fitzgerald. But the example to show really briefly, because I need to wrap up, is this group called the Movement Against Destruction in Baltimore, an incredible sort of community research organization founded to contest the planned, basically, destruction of these two historically black and working class and white working class neighborhoods in this area. And what comes out of it, incredibly, is this sort of research program that emerges, this deep sort of para-institutional format of these pamphlets released by them, incredible kind of design work, and in an amazing sort of educational turn, including a coloring book for kids against the Movement Against Destruction's coloring book. E is for exhaust, color it slowly, color it dreary, color it dirty, color it dismal and gray, color it darkish, dull, and gray. Exhaust is pollution. So this is sort of, I guess, in the wider research for me, this is one kind of direction I'm really fascinated in. The other that I've been thinking a lot about is specifically the resistance to the construction of Narita Airport outside Tokyo, which led to massive sort of farmer resistance from the late 60s through the 70s. And particularly what's striking about this is the sequence of films made by this group called Ogawa Pro, kind of filmmaking collective that started filming in many ways before sort of student riots. They came out to this area to kind of, make a good riot barricade film. What's remarkable, I mean, it's a striking film. What's most potent, though, is the fact that essentially they stay. Having come to sort of film the moment of action, in many ways the collective remains for years and years, and sort of summer in Sanrizuka becomes autumn, becomes winter, becomes spring, and what constitutes, in some sense, a kind of labor of training, of education and resistance comes to involve a much wider set of activities, of farming, of sort of forms of domestic work, et cetera. And so I want to just sort of end with that moment to think about, in some sense, the gap between the halt, the ruptural halt of the barricade, and perhaps this sort of other work, maybe from the laser to this other sort of slower process of realizing that those visible moments are themselves perhaps sort of a blind spot. So I'll end with that. Thank you all.